I would want to lay the groundwork for anyone who wants to go to Tokyo today and be able to project backwards to the Edo of the past. The place to start is with the waterways. Edo was sometimes called the Venice of the East, and the canal system was much more logical and structured than the street system, because the canals that fed from the bay, led in from the bay, were the primary mode of, or artery of transportation for all the important food and supplies that needed to come in to keep this city humming every day. So the canal system, if you look at a map from the period, from the 17th or 18th century, and there are quite a few left to us, you can see the canals form a kind of a spiral, ending up in the moats. By the end of the period, symbolic, but nonetheless originally defensive moats that surround Edo Castle. And Edo Castle really did occupy a large space that remains vacant on most of these maps. It's a big open square because it was verboten, it was forbidden to actually depict the interior of the castle on a map. But you can see clearly where it is, and you can see that it's surrounded by a couple of rings of moats, which become part of the canal system. And this is a very different urban plan than that of the traditional cosmological planned capitals of East Asia. So Kyoto is a classic example based on the Tang capital of Chang'an, its Chinese predecessor, of the East Asian rectilinear, very precisely laid out, gridded city. And you can see it's laid out on a very carefully calculated north-south axis, with the most powerful people having their residences in the north, the emperor, and then the powerful nobility clustered close to the emperor. Street names were given numbers 1 through whatever, descending from the imperial palace, and the lower your street number, basically the more prestigious your address was. So that is a very clear pattern, and it still survives in the city of Kyoto. And you can see, although the everyday life had drifted a little bit from that plan, the grid has never gone away. But in Edo, it was never built that way. This city evolved organically as a defensive, fortified, moated port city. And both of those features, the fortification and the port canal system, are the primary thing that a visitor today can see. You have to look for those canals now, because they're actually not completely buried, but they're often underneath elevated expressways. That was one of the places that elevated highways could be built in a city that desperately needed to bust out of its congestion when car traffic and truck traffic started to really fill the modern city. But if you go under those elevated expressways, you can find those. The other things that are left are relatively few, because the city, like all Japanese cities, was made of wood and paper. It burned badly, and then it was bombed quite severely in the 20th century. So very few districts, even from the Edo period, are still intact from that bombing. And actually, if we look at a map of the bombing damage from the fire bombing that was done in World War II, we can see that the areas that incurred the most damage map on almost one-to-one onto the most densely populated commoner districts along the river that ran through the middle of the city. That was low-lying land. Much of it was actually bay fill. And so in an earthquake, it would liquefy, just as happened in San Francisco during the big earthquake, and fires broke out very easily there. So that is a heavily, heavily damaged and rebuilt area. The higher lands to the west of the city comprise the homelands of the wealthy domain lords. Those were the suburbs, the original suburbs, and you can walk those hills today, and more of that property actually is still intact. You can find some remnants of those mansions. And to be honest, one of the ways that I look for indirect legacies of the Edo period in the modern city is by trying to figure out where the really large institutions are today, are situated, and how did they get that land. And very often, if it's a big university, a big government building, even sometimes big railway stations, military training grounds, those were all sited on lands of the daimyo after modernization, when the Meiji Restoration took over these lands and the daimyo were dispossessed. So you can find legacies like that. In terms of actual monuments, the biggest single artifact that remains is the castle compound. The donjon, the tower, is gone. It burned down in the 1600s and was never rebuilt. But the massive, beautiful, I think they're beautiful, stone walls that are 18 feet thick that surrounded Edo Castle, those are still in place. And those are a very impressive monument to the fact that this was a military bastion.